Hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we are bidding our solemn farewells to the Pac 12 Conference as we talk about college football realignment and what that means for college football as a whole, as well as discussing some of the downsides to realignment and expansion and trying to figure out some remedies for those potential problems. But before we get into that, I would like to quickly run through a timeline of how we ended up being in the situation that we're in right now. I believe this goes all the way back to 1990 when Penn State joined the Big Ten, making them an 11-team, 10-team conference. The following year, the Big East was formed, but it was primarily made up from schools that were independent beforehand, like Miami and West Virginia. In 1992, you had Arkansas and South Carolina join the SEC, while Florida State joined the ACC to counter the Big Ten, adding Penn State and the Big East being formed. But much like with the Big East and Penn State, to be entirely honest with you, these were all teams that were independent before joining the conference. There wasn't a whole lot of conference poaching going on yet until hypothetically 1996, where Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and Baylor joined the Big Eight to create the Big 12 after the Southwest Conference dissolved because of all of the recruiting violations and scandals that marred that conference during its last 15 years or so. For those of you unaware, SMU was part of the Southwestern Conference when they received the death penalty. Then we have to jump forward a little bit to 2004, where Miami and Virginia Tech joined the ACC in order to make more money. There wasn't particularly a reason other than that for Miami to jump to the ACC, in my opinion. Virginia Tech was kind of shafted. When they came to the conference, they weren't made a full member until like 2 years after they were in the conference. So I think they became a full member in 2001 and then ended up leaving in 2004 to the ACC. So they were kind of maybe getting revenge on the Big East for not giving them the money up front, but it's whatever. And then in 2005, the ACC also added Boston College. In 2011, Nebraska jumped to the Big Ten and Colorado left for the Pac-12. The Pac-12 also added Utah in that arrangement. Then in 2012, Texas A&M and Missouri go to the SEC, with West Virginia and TCU replacing them in the Big 12. Then in 2014, Maryland and Rutgers joined the Big Ten for absolutely no reason at all, and Louisville joins the ACC to replace Maryland. And if I'm being entirely honest with you, the ACC got the better deal. Now we're getting to all of the recent stuff with in 2023, Cincinnati, Houston, UCF, and BYU are joining the Big 12. While next year, USC, UCLA, which was announced in 2022, along with Oregon and Washington, which was announced just the other day, are going to the Big 10. Utah, Arizona, and Arizona State are going to the Big 12 next year, which was announced again just the other day. And Texas and Oklahoma are going to the SEC, which was first announced in 2021 and also announced the other day. Colorado is rejoining the Big 12. So who in the hell do we blame for all of this? I don't think you can blame the money so much, because money has always been a factor. But even with that, nowadays there is no downside that comes with that money. Beforehand, there was the threat of getting kicked out of a conference because you couldn't bring in money. That's what happened to Temple. They got kicked out of the Big East. Nowadays, you aren't going to see a team get kicked out because they aren't bringing in money. I mean, do you think Vanderbilt football is bringing any real money to the SEC? But they're not about to kick out Vanderbilt. Do you think Rutgers is doing jack shit for the Big Ten? Nah, but they're not about to get kicked out. And the Pac-12 may be a reason why the Pac-12 doesn't exist anymore, and the reason why USC and UCLA jumped ship was because they wouldn't kick out Stanford and all of these underperforming schools like Cal as well, and get them replaced with teams that could actually bring in money. And I know that people are going to bring up, other sports when we're talking about this. Like Stanford has the most national championships of any school, like overall across all sports. But the only college sports that are capable of making money right now are football and basketball. And for the vast majority of basketball programs, they're still a net negative, even at the Division One level. And the part that most people are mad about is the regional identities no longer exist. When conferences were becoming a thing, the Big East was created. The Southeastern Conference actually meant that there were teams that were in the Southeast. The Southwestern Conference existed, and that was basically just teams in Texas. But that's whatever. It was still a regional identity. The Big Ten was Midwest, and the ACC was the Atlantic coast. That used to mean something. That doesn't anymore. And in previous instances of expansion, regional identities still mattered. When the ACC expanded, they brought in Miami and Boston College and Virginia Tech. Those are all teams that are relatively close to the Atlantic coast, even though they were poaching those teams from a different power conference like the Big East. They were still keeping their regional identities intact. If you want to point to a moment where there was a point of no return, it was probably 2011 when Nebraska joined the Big Ten. Now, there was another power conference to power conference move in that offseason with Colorado going to the Pac 12, but Colorado was not a major player in the Big 12. It wasn't one of their biggest, most prominent programs. They had a good stretch in the 90s, but they weren't the marquee brand defining team in their conference. So them leaving wasn't really the end of the world. But Nebraska was a brand defining team for the Big 12. It was Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. And the Big 10 poached them with the allure of money. A bigger TV contract was a main reason why Nebraska left the Big 12. It was also a big reason why Oklahoma and Texas left the Big 12 for the SEC. And that was the death of college football as we knew it. The second that that was announced, it was the final nail in the coffin, and everybody and every team was fair game. So the Big Ten went out and said, hey, USC, UCLA, we make just as much money as the SEC. We'll bring you in as full memberships in 2024. Come on down. And USC and UCLA said, hey, financially, we've been carrying this conference for a very long time. Why the hell would I continue to be held back by the other teams that are just smaller brands than us when I can join the Big Ten that has 4 or 5 brands that are just as big as us and get twice as much money, maybe? So if you're looking for somebody to blame, I think it's probably the Big Ten and the SEC, because the Big Ten showed, hey, we can poach major brands from other conferences now. And the SEC then did it better by taking Oklahoma and Texas. And then the Big Ten countered again by doing it even better than that and taking USC and UCLA. I think all of this, though, is extremely short-sighted by these teams deciding to jump ship for these TV contracts, because these teams are going to end up making less money than they could have, in my opinion, if they had just stayed in their conference and renegotiated their TV contracts when the time came. Now, I know the Pac-12 kind of sucked balls at that, and they don't have a TV contract in 2024, and apparently they're desperate for Apple TV to give them anything now, that they might even just join the ACC to get in on their deal. I don't know. There's a whole mess with that Pac-12 stuff, but it doesn't excuse Texas and Oklahoma doing what they did. I think all of these teams are going to end up making less money because there's going to be less big games. Now, on the screen right now is a picture of Colin Cowherd and a tweet that he put out. Now, expecting Colin Cowherd to have a good take is like expecting a piece of shit that you found on the ground while you were hiking on a trail to taste like a filet mignon from Gordon Ramsay. But this one is so fucking stupid. I can't stand it, and there are so many people that are talking about this. And it makes no goddamn sense when you think about it for longer than 5 seconds. Colin Cowherd tweeted out, when USC is playing the Badgers on Saturday night in Camp Randall and the Huskies are hosting Michigan on Mount Lake while the Ducks are in a shootout in Eugene with Penn State, that loyalty stuff will fade pretty quickly. Give me more big games, I'm in, shoulder shrug emoji. Newsflash, guys. When USC is playing Wisconsin at a night game in Camp Randall, it isn't going to fucking matter because USC is probably going to be 6-2 because they had to play Ohio State and then they lost some other game to Oregon or whatever the fuck. And then Wisconsin is going to be 5-4 or 4-5 because they lost a rivalry game against Iowa and another rivalry game against Minnesota and then drew games against Ohio State and Penn State. And Washington hosting Michigan isn't going to be a big matchup because Michigan, they might be undefeated, but Washington still has to play Oregon, USC, and probably one of Penn State and Ohio State as well. So they're going to end the season at best 8-4, but probably more like 7-5. So that isn't a big game either. And Oregon playing Penn State isn't going to be a big game at all because Penn State hasn't won the Big Ten since 2016, and they're not going to pretty much anytime soon. And Oregon sure as fuck isn't competing in the Big Ten when they have Michigan, Ohio State, USC, potentially UCLA to deal with. We would consider that a big game nowadays because it's an out-of-conference game. But when it becomes an in-conference game, it's going to matter about as much as Wisconsin playing Iowa every year. Neither of those teams are winning the goddamn Big Ten. Each conference can only have, at a maximum, probably 5 teams that are actually contending for the conference. So when your conference has 18 teams in it, that means 13 other teams have no fucking chance to win the conference. And if you have no chance to win the conference or compete at a high level, you are not going to be able to recruit like you are currently recruiting. Not to mention the fact that basically everybody in the country that isn't Georgia or Miami is bitching about NIL problems. Hell, that kid from Detroit, Dante Moore, might fucking transfer from UCLA before he's played a game because he isn't getting the NIL deal that he was promised. And you think you're going to have more money when you're winning less games? So after 3 or 4 years, this shit's going to settle itself out. And what we're probably going to see is a Big Ten that has 3 real contenders to win the conference in Michigan, Ohio State, and USC. Just like right now, they have 3 real contenders to win the conference in Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State. But Penn State hasn't won the goddamn conference in 7 years, so maybe they aren't even really a team that can win the conference. And don't get me started on the SEC. Texas hasn't been good consistently since Mac Brown left, and Oklahoma football will never be relevant again as long as they are in the SEC. And I've only been talking about relatively big brands here. Like, what about Auburn or Ole Miss? You think they're gonna compete anytime soon? No. What you're gonna see is a perpetual 3 to 4 year cycle where they hire a head coach, say we need to get back to competing for the SEC championship every year, and then they don't, and then they fire them. And you can say the same damn thing about a team like Wisconsin or Minnesota in the Big Ten. They have no chance of winning or even competing in their conference. So why would I, as a recruit, go there as like a big time recruit? Why would I go there when they're going to have NIL problems because they're not winning, which means their boosters aren't going to give them money for the NIL, which means they're not going to get recruits, which means they're not going to win because they can't get recruits. And the cycle continues on and on and on. So how do we fix this? How do we fix this problem? The answer is privatization. Stop having the TV deals be done by the conference and instead force these broadcasters to negotiate with each individual team to broadcast their games. This would put the emphasis back on teams being good at football, because these broadcasters are not going to give you a good deal and a lot of money if you're a smaller brand and you aren't at least entertaining or a good football program. And that would force these teams to actually try and have a good football team in order to get more money from these broadcasters. And would also save the broadcasting companies a fuckload of money, because now you don't have to pay every single team in the Big Ten $80 million every year when they're not giving you that much money. Instead, you pay Michigan, Ohio State, USC $100 million every year, and then you pay Wisconsin 55, then you pay Iowa 45, then you pay UCLA 60, then you pay Rutgers 15 million because they suck. And the broadcast companies save money doing this. And in order for these smaller school teams to have a chance at making more money, they would have to put together a football team so that they could actually have an interesting matchup and so that the games can mean something. Then they'll be able to draw more viewers and therefore be able to get more money, which means boosters are going to start paying attention because you actually have a good team and they're going to give you NIL money. And then you're going to be able to recruit better because now you have NIL money. And then now that you're recruiting better, you're going to be able to consistently be good. And I know someone is going to say, but that's not fair to these smaller schools or these schools that are smaller brands. And you're goddamn right, it's not fair. And it shouldn't be fair. You're not pulling your fucking weight. Why in the hell should these big brands take less money than what they earn for these broadcasting companies because your ass is making less money than what they do? A more reasonable counter argument would be, Nathan, if you're just giving all of the big schools more money, then they're going to just have more money than everybody else, and the big schools are going to be the only teams that are ever competing for anything. And yes, that's correct. And you want to know why I don't care? Because that's what's happening right now. Ohio State won 4 Big Ten championships, and then now Michigan's won these last 2. Since they expanded to their current format in 2014, Ohio State's won 5, Michigan's won 2, Michigan State won, and Penn State won. You want to know what those are? The 4 biggest brands in the Big Ten. And it's even clearer in the SEC, where the last championships moving backwards goes like this: Georgia, Alabama, Alabama, LSU, Alabama, Georgia, Alabama, 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 Auburn, Alabama, LSU. Do you want to know what those are? The 3 biggest brands in the SEC. And in the Big 12, they had like Oklahoma win like 6 straight. And then these past 2 years, you've had Kansas and Baylor win in a year where Oklahoma and Texas both sucked, and Lincoln Riley gave up on his football program because he knew he was going to USC halfway through the goddamn year. And it's the same story with the ACC. Since 2010, so starting in 2011, you have Clemson, Florida State, Florida State, Florida State, Clemson, 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 Pittsburgh, Clemson. And if the trajectory of Clemson and Florida State's programs currently go the way that they're going, then that's not going to change anytime soon. Ironically, the only conference that actually had a decent amount of parity doesn't fucking exist anymore, and that was the Pac-12. As since 2011, it goes like this: Oregon, Stanford, Stanford, Oregon, Stanford, Washington, USC, Washington, Oregon, Oregon, Utah, Utah. So that's actually a decent amount of parity. You've got some different teams going on in there, and it isn't dominated by just the biggest brands. So in every major conference that still exists, you already have a very select few of teams that are actually capable of winning the conference. And those teams are going to make the vast majority of the money. So if you stop lumping all of the bad programs with the good programs and bringing down the ceiling of the good programs and bringing up the floor of the bad programs, then the good programs would have an incentive to keep being good, and the bad programs would have an incentive to be good. And then you could have actual competition. Another unintended effect of all of these super conferences getting made is that out of conference games are likely to go the way of the Pac 12 and fucking die. Because if I'm in an 18 or 20 team conference, which might happen, and I have to play 9 or potentially even 10 in conference games, why would I schedule an out of conference game that is actually difficult? Another contributing factor to this is the 12 team playoff, where all of a sudden I don't have to schedule an out of conference game because I don't need that win in order to be ranked in the top 12 and have a good chance of making the playoffs. So these programs now have no incentive to go out of their way like Michigan and Texas are doing starting next year with a home and home. They have no reason to do that because if they can go 10-2 in a Power 5 conference and they started the year ranked in the top 10, they've got a pretty good chance of making the playoffs still because they're already playing 9 or 10 Power 5 teams. There is a possibility that these broadcasting networks are going to want to have these games anyway, so they could, nudge these teams into playing games like this. But the teams would still have to want to do that, and I don't think they will. What if Texas can't get off the ground in the SEC? What if Michigan starts losing to Ohio State again and missing the playoffs? What if Florida State starts losing to a surprising UNC team or it's somebody else? Why would they then go out of their way to make their life more difficult than it needs to be? Because the only goal is to make the 12-team playoffs. There is no way to have a successful season if you don't do that. So how do you fix that? Well, if conferences do go to 18 or 20, then you make 2 divisions within the conference and then they play in the title game instead of this 2 best teams bullshit that they're trying now. So if you have 18 teams, this works out a little bit better because then you can cut it in half and you have 9 in each division. So you can have your 9 in division games and 1 crossover game with the other division and then 2 out of conference games. With 20, you might have to do like 4 divisions of 5 instead of 2 divisions of 9, and then you have to have like a 2-tiered conference championship game. At least that would be kind of interesting because you wouldn't really have one conference in either of those scenarios, because if you have 18 teams that you split into 2 9-team divisions, that's 1 team away from being a full-blown conference on their own. And if you have those 4 5-team divisions, then that's just like the NFL, but a little bit more teams in it. But actually, I forgot to mention one major downside to all of these conferences expanding, and that's that the group of 5 teams that are playing these teams are no longer going to have access to that Power 5 money. Because, when Alabama plays UAB, they give UAB a significant amount of money to play them on their schedule. And that can help a lot of these smaller programs, A, appeal to recruits because you're playing against Alabama, and B, have money for better facilities and to pay higher quality coaches, etc., etc. So now those teams are not going to have access to that revenue stream, or at least not as many teams are going to have access to that revenue stream. So you can fix it by doing some relatively creative stuff within the conferences, but really all you would be doing is just making either 2 full-blown conferences that run under one banner, or doing what the NFL does but worse, because you don't play 17 games, so you can't have all of the multiple matchups and everything that would be needed for a system like that to work. The last thing that I want to talk about here in the downsides is, for every other sport but football, this sucks so much ass. Like for baseball and softball, you play like 3-game series against these teams, which means that you're going to be traveling for 5 days, which means you're missing basically a full week of school. And then if you're a softball player for UCLA or some shit like that, you're flying to Seattle, and Oregon, and those are your closest trips, and you're going to have to go play Rutgers probably twice. There's a reason why they still do regionals in the college baseball World Series. And for stuff like basketball, you might have a home game 2 days after you have to fly across the country to USC if you're Michigan, or you might have to have like two road games back to back. Like if USC has to play on the road against Maryland, and then 5 days later they have to play on the road against Michigan State in East Lansing, what the hell are they going to do? Are they going to fly back to California for 3 days only to have to fly again to Michigan? Or are you just going to go from Maryland to Michigan and just hang out there? I mean, that would probably be a better option for the players and also the school, because you're not paying for two more cross country flights, one to fly back to California and then one to fly to Michigan. In which case, these kids are going to be away from school for 7, 8 days. And also, just the airfare that these colleges are going to have to pay now for every single one of their goddamn sports is absolutely absurd. Like UCLA baseball, it has to play like two road games against every single team in the Big Ten. So they're going to be flying across country like 20 times every season. But unlike with some of these other ones, I do actually think this solution is probably going to happen, which is separate football and maybe basketball from all of the other sports so that those other sports can still have local area games, and then you're not paying for cross country travel for teams that don't make any money, and these student athletes don't have to spend half their goddamn semester on a plane. Or you could just stop making them go to class, which is not an option for really anybody other than basketball or football players. All in all, I think these programs are missing the big picture, because in order to make the most money, you have to be good. And with conferences doubling in size, there's only going to be a certain amount of teams that are actually going to be good. So you are dramatically decreasing your chances of being one of those teams by having these super conferences. So I believe they would actually end up making more money if they kept the conferences small and therefore more competitive. And then if we had like 7 or 8 conferences with automatic bids into the 12-team playoffs with 4 wildcard spots, all of a sudden the regular season matters much more than it does currently. But how do you get to like 7 or 8 conferences? Well, if we put the Pac 12 back where it is, we already have 6 major conferences with the American and the Power 5. And we can pretty easily make 2 more with a little bit of shuffling around of teams. Take, for instance, the ACC. Lost in all of the chaos of Thursday and Friday this past week was a report that there are potentially 7 or 8 programs looking to leave the ACC. I don't think the SEC wants them, and I don't think the Big Ten are going to take more than Clemson and Florida State. So they don't particularly have a whole lot of good options. So the option that I am going to tell them they should do is make their own conference and remake the Big East. So the Big East would consist of Florida State, Clemson, Miami, North Carolina State, Virginia, Virginia Tech, and then we'll add in Coastal Carolina, UConn, and USF so that you can get the Tampa market with USF and have a big national brand in basketball with UConn. This would give these teams, who are all relatively big brands with dedicated fan bases, a chance to say, hey, we've moved on from some of the smaller brands that are left over in the old ACC, and then they could go to these broadcast companies and say, yo, give us a better deal. We have most of the big brands from the old ACC and some new brands that are in either a big market or a high value brand like UConn. But what about the other 7 teams in the ACC? Well, they could add in 3 or potentially more teams and just stay as the ACC with their current media deal. And when that one runs up, do you want to know what you would pitch to them? We're very competitive in basketball and in football, though we don't necessarily have like a national championship caliber team anymore. What we do have is extraordinary parity, which means that all of our games matter and are interesting to all of the fan bases in this conference, which would get you pretty high ratings. And to be entirely honest with you, with some of the big boys out of the way, some programs that always had legitimate high end potential, like Georgia Tech and Pittsburgh, could maybe live up to that potential. So the new ACC, in my mind, would be Pittsburgh, Louisville, Boston College, Wake Forest, Syracuse, Georgia Tech, Duke, and we'll add in Appalachian State, ECU, and Tulane. Now, the first thought that is going to go into your head is, holy shit, this is a Mickey Mouse conference if I've ever seen one. Well, you're wrong. Wake Forest has been really good recently. Duke has been much better than anticipated. Syracuse has Dino Babers, who, if he can find the right players, is actually a pretty good football coach. Pat Narduzzi at Pittsburgh is a very good football coach. Jeff Fromm at Louisville is going to get Louisville going, in my opinion. Georgia Tech is a legitimate head coach away from potentially being a powerhouse. Appalachia State is extraordinarily consistent. Tulane just beat a major Power 5 team in a major bowl game this past year, and ECU, even though it has happened in spurts, has had a pretty consistent football program as well. And there are even other teams that they could potentially add as well. But that was really just an interesting idea that I thought about doing while I was thinking of what to say in this video. So I know it's not going to happen, but man, it'd be cool, wouldn't it? Well, the good news is that I do not believe this current setup is sustainable. I think these large conferences are likely to fail and fall apart, and I sincerely think that TV providers are not going to be willing to shed out all of these millions to 18 or 20 teams when well over half of them aren't in great markets or aren't national brands. So when they come back around, I think what they might try to do is just go to the big brands and say, yo, why don't you say that you're not going to negotiate as a conference anymore, you're just going to negotiate as an individual team, because then you can get much more money. And we'll pay you more money because we don't have to keep that number down, so that we can justify giving this smaller school more money to our business people who are telling us what to do and who to go after. So I think it's maybe not likely, but a definitive possibility that when these TV contracts come up towards the end of the 2020s and the early 2030s, you could see teams start to spread out more again. And I am going to cling on to that hope, because I do not believe that these super conferences are good for college football. And I hope that we can go back to a 5 major conference, or even hopefully a 6 major conference format in the future. And that is all that I have for you today. If you're new to the channel, I primarily talk about the Big Ten and the NFC North. So during the season, I will be covering all of the Big Ten teams. I will make it a point to mention at least one thing from every Big Ten team, and I'll also talk about each NFC North team quite a bit. I will also talk about, the big issues that come up, the big stories that come up every week in both college football and the NFL as well. So go ahead and like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this. And if you disagreed with me at any point, or you just want to let me know something, go ahead and leave a comment in the comment section down below. But let's keep it civil, everybody. After all, what do I know? I'm just some asshole, and I'll see you next time.